everyone, and welcome to Class 2 of Family History Research from the Beginning, or an introduction. This week we're going to focus on the census. But let's first of all congratulate everyone managed to log into the site, and I think everyone has contributed now to the welcome forum. About just over half of you completed the survey on getting more or telling us a bit more about your family history. Doesn't matter if you've not managed to complete that, but in case you would like another opportunity to add something to that, I will open the survey again this evening and leave it open for a few days. So everyone's up and running. Hope you're all keen to find out more, got some ideas and got some thoughts about what you want to look for. Some of you, in fact, indicated via the survey some areas that you would like me to look at to demonstrate how we can actually search for people in the census. So this week we're actually going to have two short videos. The first video, as you had last week, is the one which is accompanied by the handout, and the second video is going to be me demonstrating looking for some of those ancestors, those elusive ancestors that you posted in the survey form, and we'll see what we can find out about them. We'll also be talking this week about referencing or looking at your sources, and there is a handout on there for you. Now, I'm sure it's going to provoke a lot of questions because a lot of the information in this particular handout is actually relevant to citing a whole variety of sources and not just looking at the initial birth, marriage, death, census records that we'll be looking at on this course. So don't panic when you look at some of the information there. We will be distilling down the correct information for you, and it is a really good habit to get into if you've not done so already, to almost automatically reference your sources when you're actually writing something down. But let's begin by looking at the census. Census really is an official count or survey of a population. It records various details, carried out lots of places across the world for quite a considerable time, and we'll look at that as well. But why would that be interesting and useful to us as family historians? Well, the best place for us to start looking at some of the other information surrounding our own family and our own family history is to know where people were at a given point in time. And often we know that from addresses, of course, on birth records, marriage records, and death records. But that's information pertaining to an individual. What's so great about the information on the census is it gives us an opportunity to look at a family as a whole, and to look also at them in their context of where they lived and their neighbours around them. And by using the information on the census, it's often feasible and possible to try and work out when the parents were married, when births of particular children occurred, even possible to think about moving forward to when someone might have died if we know the ages and that they were alive at a particular time in a census, and whether or not they were married at the time. And it also gives you lots of information on occupations and whether or not they owned the land, although ownership of the land won't be specific in the census and you have to find that information out elsewhere. But it certainly gives you an address from which you can try and find out more. Now, this is an example, and I realise that on the screen this isn't particularly readable, but if you look at the PDF handout that goes along with this video, you will of course be able to magnify that on the screen, although we're going to be looking at some other census records as an activity, which we'll explain later as well. We're not going to be transcribing the information from the screenshots of various census forms at the moment. It's more or less an idea just now to give you a look at the kinds of information that's typically recorded in a census. And this is an example from 1881. It's a particular individual in here named Jemima Waterston, and she is listed here with her family in Forfar. And if you look carefully, we have the Waterston family here, and here they all are. They're living here. We've got the head of the family. We've got a wife and we've got some children. So information tends to give you information about a whole family in one place. And this is the Waterston family in Forfar. Now let's have a wee look at that closer up. And here we have John Edmund Waterston, who's head. He's married. He's a farmer of 175 acres, of which 170 are arable, and he employs 3 men and 2 women. And he was born in Forfar. And the names of his family, his wife and their children, and here's Jemima, who we talked about very briefly over the page, and all their children are here. It's interesting to note, because we know from this where the birthplaces of people are. And here we have John himself, who's born in Forfar, but his wife is born in the United States of America, as are 4 of the children. However, the youngest child here, who's John Jackson, is born in Forfar. He's aged 3. So already we might have some further information from this census, perhaps indicating that John has travelled over to the United States, where he met and married Jemima, lived there for some time when they had their children, and then came back to Forfar. There are also 2 servants listed here, one who is 18 and one who's 15. Clearly we've just read there that James is a farmer and he's employing these men. The children are at school. Now sometimes in various censuses when somebody's at school they'll be referred to as a scholar, in which case we have here. And the first time I saw that referring to one member of my family, I did think I had somebody that was some sort of academic, but looking at it carefully I realised that although this person was 11 or 12, they were actually at school. And that's how the occupation of a school child would be recorded. Often there's not a record of an occupation for a woman, although here we can see that Jemima is actually listed as a farmer's wife. Again, we've seen that this column here shows us the place of birth, and this is for John, and we've mentioned already Jemima and the 4 children being born in the USA. And it's interesting to speculate the possibilities, and of course this census will give us a good clue as to do that. We may find a marriage of John and Jemima in Scotland, indicating, as one of the suggestions here, is that she was a widow, or we may of course find that John has travelled to the US. The family were all born there and John and the family travelled back. And we will discuss how you can look for passenger lists at some later stage. We also mentioned that there were 2 servants in the house. Jane Scott, who's 19, born locally as well, and Jessie, who's 15, and also born in Forfarshire. And one last piece of information we've got here is that the house was a considerably sized house, because in the very last column we've got an indication for the number of rooms with more than 1 windows, and in the case of the Waterston family that is a 9-roomed house, so it is quite a good size of house. With regard to the history of the census, it's thought to originate, as stated here, in ancient Rome, and was carried out certainly as part of the Roman Empire, usually about every 5 years. So the history of governments and organisations taking account of their population does go very far back. Some early records in Britain, obviously everyone's heard of the Domesday Book, but we also had the very first national census across the whole of Britain in 1801. However, the very early census records, and it was then that it was deemed to be important to take a census every 10 years, they were only giving statistical information and there was no names recorded. There are a few odd records from different parts of the country where maybe for various local reasons a census was taken and perhaps some names mentioned. But since 1841, the names of each person listed in the household has been included in the census, and the only break in that was in 1941, where there was no census due to the war taking place. The reasons for the census happening, the very first one was uncertainty over demand. There was also some censuses taken to look at the demand for or the availability of what might be military service or military men around in the country. But the very first one, as we can see here, was right across the country and in 1801, although it didn't happen in Ireland until 1821. The kinds of information recorded were just how many houses were inhabited, how many persons there were, and you can see there the kinds of information. And if you're interested in looking at that, because it all still exists, remember, with no names, if you look at the site there, visionofbritain.org.uk, you can get quite a sense of the information that was recorded in all of these early censuses. There are information on all of the censuses available at that page, so have a good look. But for our purposes, to trace our family, really 1841 census is our starting point. Now in Scotland that's particularly helpful because of course we didn't have our birth, marriage and death records beginning until 1855. So that's why we've started off looking at the census in more detail this week. Although the 1841 census didn't contain a great deal of detail, that was subsequently added to in each year. Just as now, census enumerators delivered forms, although now, of course, if you recall the 2011 census, there was an opportunity to do that online. The forms were checked and then they were entered into what were called the enumerators books, which are summaries of what the information provided by each family were, and they were then collected in enumeration districts. And that's changed slightly over the years as statutory registration began and we had registration districts, but certainly in the early stages it was very close to the parishes. And here's an example of an 1841 census. This is the summary book completed by the enumerator. They have been digitised and they're all available online, and again we'll talk about where you can find these census records. Now this is from Portpatrick Village, and you can see here we've got distinct addresses down the left hand side, and then we have members of the household. You can tell the occupation, the age, whether they're male or female, and their names as well. The second or the last column, you can see here we've actually got two to a page, indicates whether or not the person named was born in the county which they are currently living in. So it doesn't give you information about a place of birth, but it will either say yes or no if they were born in the county. Sometimes you'll see a letter E for England or I for Ireland, but often you don't see very much more than that. And one other thing to bear in mind, although you can see a particular family group, on the 1841 census there was no indication of how related the people were within the family. There was also an instruction given to the enumerators that for adults they had to round the age down to the nearest 5. Now if you look, you'll see that hasn't actually been undertaken by this particular census enumerator, but you will always find a huge number of them who did comply obviously with this request, and so anyone who is listed on the 1841 census as being, for example, of age 35 may be anywhere between age 35 and age 39 because they were rounded down the way to the nearest 5. The information, just as we've talked about, was recorded, their names, whether they were male or female, their age, where they were living, and their occupation, if they were born in the county, and again a notification there of the ages being rounded down. There are some parishes which are missing. The records haven't survived, and some of them in fact are in Fife. And if you want to have a look at the handout, we'll tell you where to look for that information on Scotland's people. So there are some issues with looking at the 1841 census in that we don't know the relationships of people, and often we can make a good guess at that. And we also have some indications that the ages may not be as accurate as we would like them to be. Although to be fair, if you have tracked a member of your family across a number of censuses already, you will find that ages often weren't that particularly accurate anyway. Beyond 1841, lots of information began to be added, including the relationship to the head of the family, also whether someone was married, widowed, single, or a widower, where born, and also there was questions which of course used the political language of the time, whether someone was blind or deaf and dumb, and in some whether they were an imbecile or feeble-minded, and that was the questions pertaining at the time. Here's an example then from 1851. And for those of you who have ancestors who perhaps came from Ireland, it would be wonderful to think that always, and sorry, this red arrow has moved when the slide's been made, I notice. I'm actually hoping that it was pointing here, and these particular people gave their place of birth in Ireland very specifically, and they've given Drumore in County Tyrone. However, I would expect that most of you may already be aware of this, but lots of people in the census who do come from Ireland, their birthplace is simply listed as Ireland. Similarly, if they were born in England, you may well find that their birthplace is just listed as England. Generally, if they're born in Scotland, you do get the parish and the county of their birth. Not always the case, but that's very commonly the case. By 1861, we now had the Registrar General having put into place the statutory records, and questions in that census they began to ask about the number of rooms with windows and the number of children who were attending school. And an example here, again, we've got just highlighting we have someone who's born in Ireland. So just to let you see that that often is what you'll get. As you'll see here, we've got people born in England. And again, if you're interested in looking at these records in more detail, if you enlarge the screen view when you're looking at the PDF file on your computer, you'll be able to see a lot more detail. But we're only sort of having a look at the kind of information that was recorded in each census. And here we have an 1871 census. Again, we can see that this time we've got a bit more detail. We've got information about the number of children who are at school. We've got questions about whether any of these people are blind, deaf and dumb, imbecile or a lunatic. And we also have the question here regarding the number of windowed rooms. In 1881, very similar to the previous one, you can see what we have there. And in 1891, perhaps the most interesting addition, if you've got family who lived in a Gaelic-speaking area, there's an additional column now indicating whether the person spoke Gaelic or Gaelic and English. And also we've got some employment status noted here, whether someone was an employer or was employed. So slight and subtle differences between the different census records, but all of them giving this huge treasure trove of information pertaining to an individual family. 1901, you can see in here we have a couple of people here speaking Gaelic and English, and this is in Glasgow. This is a nice area here. We've got an 11-roomed house, so we've got an area which is perhaps a bit more affluent, and you'll notice, I think, as well, there's considerable numbers of servants listed in these particular households. So you're going to get some quite useful information about the social context of the family that you're searching for. And perhaps the best census of all is that from 1911, which was released over the last couple of years. because there's a particular question on there for married women, which is very very great information. It tells you the duration of the current marriage, the number of children born alive, and the number of children still living. So if you were looking for someone and you had found them on the 1901 census and they were not around in 1911, then it may be because that was one of the children who died. And again, you can find a lot of information out just from that particular question. You're also getting an indication of the number of persons in the house and nationality if they're born in a foreign country. There are also some codes which identified particular areas of work, of industry, or areas of service, and again we'll give you some more information on that as we go through the week. And there's an example of a 1911 census. You'll see it's quite different from the ones that we've just looked at previously. And in fact there are differences in the existing or what survives across the UK for the 1911 census. This is our enumerator information, collected information on a number of households, as we've seen in the previous censuses in Scotland, but the kind of information that's being collected, because there's some more questions on the number of years married and the number of children, etc. The census itself, the summary of the enumerators books extends over 2 pages. In England, Wales and in Ireland, you actually see an individual record for a household. And that's quite different, and it's particular information on just one household rather than the enumeration books. And we'll come back to that when we look at English Irish records later on. There's also a few interesting ones that you may see sometimes. Obviously this particular enumerator got a bit bored and started to do some doodling on the enumeration form. Bear in mind that we can only look at the census records in this country up to over 100 years after they were already recorded. There are changes in different parts of the world with regard to this. For example, last year the US released their 1940 census. Theirs is taken every 10 years, but at the beginning of that particular decade, so 1920, 1930 and 1940. They only have a 72-year limit on data protection, so it was released to great excitement last year. And just this year, the Canadian 1921 census has been released, although as yet I believe it's still not indexed, so it is a bit more difficult to find records of your own family. You have to think as well about names that people may be recorded under. It's fairly common that sometimes women, for example, reverted to their maiden name, so you may be looking for a different surname than you would expect. Often children who are living in a family with a stepfather may have taken that surname. So a few things that you do have to look at. And of course some places will record a large number of people if this is a record of persons within a particular institution, ship, a workhouse, for example. As we'd stated earlier, the 1841 and 1851 censuses were mainly organised on a parish record, a parish basis. So if you know that someone was married or had a baptism of a child in a particular parish, you would expect, if they were living there around that time, to find them in the same area in the census. From 1861 they were then organised on the new registration districts, and there are some slight differences in between parish and registration districts, so sometimes you may have to look at adjacent places to find your family in the census. And there's quite a lot of information you can find on that, whether that's looking at online sources or even within your own local library. We're going to talk briefly here about where to find census records, because we're going to use some of them to illustrate the examples that people have asked me to have a look at. We're probably going to look at the main 3 of them, which is Scotland's People. Scotland's People is the only place on the internet where you will find the actual census images for Scotland. There are indexes of on transcriptions of who lived in particular addresses within households on both Ancestry and on Find My Past, but neither of them have the original images, which are only available in Scotland's People. If you do have access to Ancestry, for example, through your local library, then it might be a successful strategy for you to find the records of your family there and then just go to Scotland's People to purchase the particular image associated with that. There's also at least one free site. I've mentioned FreeCen here, which is a searchable index of census records where these are transcriptions from volunteers, and perhaps you yourself may have agreed to transcribe a record at some time, and these have been made available free. When the 1940 US Census was released, I do have family in the US at that time, so I did get involved in what was then one of the largest indexing projects in the world, and I don't know how many thousand people were involved in this, but the indexes were released by the National Archives, sorry, the images were released by the National Archives in April with no index, and by dint of all the thousands of people who volunteered to transcribe those, there was a searchable index where you could look for members of your family by the end of July that year. Quite an undertaking. There are also Census Finder will point you to where you will find those censuses. There are specific different arrangements for the censuses in Ireland, and that's because these are the only two which are still in existence. And the Irish government, in conjunction with the Library Boards of Canada, actually undertook a major digitisation project a few years ago, and these are available completely free. There are some as well on the various Family Search, the Mormon site. You can also look at a number of microfiche copies of census, either in your local family history centre, local libraries, and also in New Register House in Edinburgh. But the main one that we will look at, and I've just actually got a couple of screenshots at the moment, but our second video will look at this live. This is actually a fairly old screenshot of the Scotland's People site, but we will look at the actual real site live in video too. And you can see here you do have access, in fact, now to all of the census records, including 1911, which doesn't appear on this particular screen. There's what FreeCen looks like, and again you can get in there and add some information to look, and we'll look at tips for searching people effectively in the census. Ancestry. Ancestry has got lots of transcriptions, and again we'll look at that. Similarly to Scotland's People, you do have to pay to access Ancestry, either through your own personal subscription, or if you attend your local library, you'll find there is a version of Ancestry which is free for use. In many local authorities, they have undertaken to pay for subscriptions to that service, so you may find that. And if you look at a transcription, unlike the forms and the images that we've just seen, which come from Scotland's People, you will see something like this, which will give you a transcription of the family as they appear in a particular household. You can also find lots of different ways of recording and tracing your family if that's something interesting you would be interested in doing. So you could have, a snapshot of all your family appearing in different censuses across a period of time. And we've also put some blank census forms for you online to have a look at too, so that you can get used to transcribing the information. And that's one of the activities that we're going to ask you to undertake this week. Here's what a blank form might look at. So if you're looking to record your own family member from the image, then just record them. Don't record everybody on the page, but record just the names and the relationships of the people in the family to the head of the family and the other information that's recorded on a particular census. However, you have to bear in mind that, the census are absolutely wonderful, but they're not always absolutely accurate. We've mentioned that some have been lost. Sometimes the information given by family members to the enumerator was not correct, either because somebody didn't know the correct information of where someone in the family was born or age. Sometimes it's been wrongly recorded or wrongly transferred when it was entered then into the enumeration's summary sheets. It may also have been transcribed wrongly when it's been further digitized as well. And of course, there's always the chance that you would expect to find your family in a particular area, but in fact they've moved to somewhere completely different or emigrated. You also have to be careful with first names. For example, if your father or your ancestor was named John William, he's probably not listed on the census as John William. Perhaps he was known as Will. And that's how you'll be recorded on the census form, because it wouldn't record, you know, the whole, certainly not always, sometimes it is, but not always recorded with the full name. So before you go on to this week's activity, there is a second video to watch, but we do have an activity to help you to get to grips with recording the information from a census. We mentioned last week we'd get to grips with the Pearson family. And this particular activity, there is a file of resources which are images of census records pertaining to this family. And what we're asking you to do is to transcribe 3 consecutive census returns, and you choose which ones those would be, and complete a short report on your findings. Now, like all activities on this course, this is entirely optional for you, but it will certainly give you a good opportunity to use your transcription skills and to have a go at finding out what kind of information there is on the census records. We will have a forum about this as well, and good luck in undertaking it. So we're going to finish this video now. There will be a forum for this week, and we will have a forum to talk about the referencing guide as well, which will be listed for you. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little bit about what you can do in the census records, and the second video is now going to be an opportunity for me to look for the people that you've indicated to me on the survey form. So bye for now. Remember, we do have 2 videos this week, and I look forward to hearing from you all in the forums.